watching the movie, and after watching the Academy Awards, I understand that he was the peacemaker of the world. He was loved by everyone. And I want to know from you if you felt like he was responsible for the atomic bomb being created, and did he actually have a lot to do with that, and whether or not he was a peacemaker because of the work that he had done or created and organized.
Oppenheimer was no doubt incredibly intelligent man, very, very smart. And he was very dynamic, and he attracted students, physics students, from all over the United States, wanted to take his classes, if you will. And he too, I think 2 of his students would win the Nobel Prize in theoretical physics. So there's no doubt he had a very magnetic personality. And he was organized enough that, I mean, he was able to use his gumption enough to order people around when he came in, and he had to negotiate with the army and how important Los Alamos, and he had ideas how to organize these guys. And no doubt, that was good. And in that sense, he was a good organizer and he put that together, in that sense. What my qualms, as your colleague alluding to from my talk here, is what in my opinion, though, is Christopher Nolan, in the course of making the story, the movie, I think he elevated and he starts attributing to Oppenheimer many, many things that Oppenheimer didn't do. For example, I think he suggests that Oppenheimer should have won the Nobel Prize. Well, that's simply not true. Oppenheimer never really did any original physics. They claim he invented black holes. That's not true. They said he invented antimatter. That's not true. People just are saying stuff which is not true. And the other thing is, in the Apple incident, when he tried to poison his professor at Cambridge, in the movie they have him pulling back the apple, but in real life he didn't pull it back. It was only fortunate Brackett, the guy's name was Brackett, by the way, professor. For some reason he was in a hurry and he didn't take the apple, he didn't eat it. That's what saved him. Otherwise he would be really, really sick. So what I'm trying to say is Oppenheimer certainly did good things. Now, once that's over, it seemed to me, this is my own hypothesis, he went to school in Göttingen, in western part of Germany, along with Hans Peter, so he was Jewish, but it was what I'm calling Western Jews. These are Jews who grew up under Nazi Germany, and they had a fanatical hatred for Hitler and Nazism, and they had no qualms about putting an atom bomb together and dropping it on Germany. They had no qualms about that. They were doing that. However, they seemed to be more accepting if a socialist government were to get the atom bomb. They didn't have the same kind of attitude. That it was that would be more of a friendly type of government, if you will. And so they saw the Soviet Union as a socialistic kind of government. And as I mentioned, Oppenheimer was very active in communist activities. He had in his class, his physics class, he had him participating in communist parties and things like that. So he was very, very sympathetic to the Communist Party. The ones who opposed him were, among others, Eastern European Jews. Teller, Eugen Wigner, von Neumann, von Karajan, Ulan. These are all Jews, but they all grew up in Poland, Hungary, and they understood communism, and they lived under communism, and they had just as deep a hatred of Stalin that the Western European Jews had of Hitler. They understood that if Stalin were to take over, this would be a horrible world, and just as much as it would be an absolute disaster for Hitler to have the atom bomb, so too it would be a disaster for Stalin to have the hydrogen bomb. But for whatever reason, and it's his own actions prove it, Oppenheimer seemed to be sympathetic to a socialist type of government philosophy, if you will. And so he argued that don't do it because if we don't do it, the Russians won't do it. Well, that wasn't true. As I pointed out, 3 years before he made that statement, the Russians already had a hydrogen bomb program going. And we would have, if we followed that advice, Stalin would have had an atom bomb all by himself, or a hydrogen bomb all by himself. It would have been incredibly dangerous. So it was not good advice that he did. So in that sense, that's why I have a problem calling him a peacemaker, because he was kind of socialist. He was a very socialist person. He really enjoyed that, and he trusted a socialist government to be good. And whereas people who grew up under communism knew better. So that's why to me he's not as much a hero as you want me to make him to be. Okay?
Any other questions?
Yes, sir.
So then the disparity between maybe the truth and the fiction, the book, American Prometheus, that was, you know, the basis for.
Yeah, Prometheus is the American Prometheus.
Right. So was it the director that took too much license in presenting him the way that he was presented, or was it the flawed research of the book? Which took 25 years?
All about K-Bird and K-Bird. The authors of Prometheus were also extremely convenient to making Oppenheimer a hero. So people like Lawrence, Teller, Ken Nichols, these people become they become villains. In my book, I was tossing around when I was writing my book. I said I hated what was going on in those books, and so I made a promise to myself: oh, I'm not going to show my favoritism. And so the compromise I made within me was I'm just going to, whatever Oppenheimer did, I will quote. You know, he did this, he did that, and I'll allow the reader to draw their own conclusion to what they think of the person himself. Okay, so I don't ever trash Oppenheimer in my book, but I do bring up that he argued against this, he argued against that. Oh, and by the way, the Russians really were doing this. And you can draw your own conclusions.
So if your book had been the basis for the movie, there may never have been a movie.
Oh, yeah. I think there's an incredibly exciting story. The real story.
It wouldn't center around Oppenheimer.
Well, in my mind, the real story is much more exciting than even what they did. That it was much more exciting. In many ways, often, Lawrence was the only person in the United States pushing for an atomic program. And he was flustered, he was boop, and then, like I said, the burning down of his Kyotrons in Oak Ridge, and he gets the fire department and he builds it up again, hires the local women, and it works, I mean, what he did was phenomenal, what he did. And I don't go into Johnny Foster, but Johnny leaves the MIT radiation lab. He volunteers he's a college kid, he's 20 years old, and he volunteers and he joins the American Army Air Corps, goes to Italy as a advisor, and he gets hold of a German radar set, takes it apart, puts it together, figures out how the Germans are using the radar, and then he goes around to all the air bases in Italy, 15th Air Force, and I have pictures of him briefing these teenage boys. I mean, half the crews in these bombers are teenagers, and here are these teenage boys all sitting around Johnny, this big man of 20, and he's telling them how to beat the Russian radar, and he knocked their casualties in half. Now, being in the 8th or 15th Air Force was the most dangerous job in the American military. More airmen died in the 8th Air Force alone than Marines in the entire U.S. Marine Corps in the Pacific. This one unit. If you see this show going on now, the 8th Air Force, it brings home where they're, 80, I think it's 80 men arrived, and within 3 weeks, there's 3 of them left. I mean, that's how bad it was. My uncle was in the 8th Air Force. He was killed. So my heart also goes out. And I remember talking with Johnny. I wish to God you would have got there a little bit earlier. You might have saved my uncle from death. So Johnny was a 20-year-old. He was an Olympian. He was chosen to go to the Olympics by Canada in gymnastics. And he came second. He was an honor student out of McGill University, the biggest university in Canada. And he was a second-ranking mathematics student. And he's also an Olympian. I mean, he's like a superstar. I mean, frankly. And he gets married and takes his bride in the back of a motorcycle and he drives to Berkeley. That's his next job. So he goes from Montreal to Berkeley the British had their equivalent of a Harley, and he drives this new bride. Her name's Bobby. She was a hell of a woman. She's hanging on to Johnny, and they were going across the nation. So these are characters that are above life, if you will. And they had a lot of guts, and they had a lot of guts. So with Johnny, when I mentioned that Johnny makes a revolutionary atom bomb like that, it was a lot of guts because, as I tried to point out, any failure, they always shut down, the Livermore laboratory was shut down because there were so many people wanting to shut down this place. And Johnny didn't go. He could have taken a Los Alamos design, and shot it and get everyone off his back, but he didn't do that. He came up with a revolutionary, and the same with Carl Brown and Herb York. So these guys, I have utmost admiration for, and they changed the Cold War, as I brought up with the Berlin crisis. We all know about the Cuban crisis a year later, but the Berlin crisis was so serious, Kennedy didn't get on TV busting his, hitting his chest saying, look at how brave I am. All he has is a white face saying, we're going to go to war. What are we going to do? He was nervous over Berlin. He was not so nervous a year later over Cuba. And so I know all of us grew up thinking Cuba was the big, big thing. It was not. It was the year before, and we don't know about it because it was so serious that we almost really came close to going to war.
Sounds like it'd make a great movie.
I think so too. Thank you. I think so too. I think there's great heroes. The real heroes and how it came about. It's a bit more complicated. It's not a simple thing, but it was great, and the right people got together at the right time and did what they had to do.
Okay, we have another question.
Yes, well, I hope I don't embarrass myself with this question, but I found this extremely informative and fascinating. I lived in this valley from the 60s, and all these names were part of the valley. But I have a question because I thought somehow we were going to hear a little bit about Oppenheimer and religion.
Right.
And am I totally?
No, you didn't. You talked to my wife before this, didn't you? Well, you're right. I was at Quandary because, as Rose brought up, it's the Oppenheimer movie, and my quandary was the movie has a set story. Now, when I could come up and explain the story, but then I'd be one negative after no. Like for example, no, Oppenheimer didn't pull back the apple. Oppenheimer really did try to poison his guy. That woman, that blonde at the bar that I was talking about, and Mrs. Tolman. Yeah. Well, Richard Tolman had given Oppenheimer a job at Caltech as a professor. And Oppenheimer came and he even offered him his home to stay at with free housing. And Oppenheimer repaid him by having an affair with his wife. And then 3 years later, Richard Tolman was so humiliated because it became very public. And in fact, it was that affair that really caused Lawrence to break off his friendship with Oppenheimer from what he had done to Tolman. Anyway, Tolman was so humiliated he committed suicide. So you want me to do that? And so now, if you want me to go through the movie step by step, this would be a pretty dreary briefing. So I thought, no, the story behind it was that hearing. That's the climax, right? When you have that hearing and you have the Nazi guy, Ken Nichols, the Nazi guy, kind of thing. And the hearing was demanded by Oppenheimer. It was not a trial. The whole thing occurred because Oppenheimer himself demanded it. And the first thing he did is they asked him, he said, why did you lie to Army security personnel about the Communist Party getting secrets from you? And he said, because I was an idiot. He admitted it. The first thing right off, he admitted it. Now, any of us who have ever had a security clearance, if you admit that you lied to security personnel, your clearance is gone forever. Oppenheimer knew that, and he knew he was going to, and so why on earth would he call the hearing? But what I think he did is he presented himself as a victim of McCarthyism, and it worked. 75 years later, we're having an Academy Award-winning movie, making him a hero. It worked. Now, I'm sorry, so I know Rose, you want me to make him a hero, but I can't do it because he's not a hero in my mind. He just played the game, and he played it really well. Yes, ma'am.
You showed so much remorse, at least in the movie.
I'm sorry?
You showed so much remorse about what he had done and the people that were killed, and in the movie he showed that. I think that would bring us back to the religion part.
Well, I don't know. He apparently came up with cancer, some form of cancer, because he lost all his skin, he lost all the flesh in his face, and he looks extraordinarily sick by the end of the hearing. The hearings that were held, he goes back to Princeton. And, but yeah, very tumultuous. It does come up in the movie. His marriage was tumultuous because of all the affairs he was having. I mean, he was pretty much a philanderer. His wife was having a very difficult time. And I think, despite the dramatics, it was all brought out in the open that he had lied. He was suspected of being a communist spy and all that, and I think it had an effect on him that way. And I don't know what to tell you that he was a pusher. There was a committee formed, how they wanted to use the atomic bomb in World War II. It was called the Interim Committee. And Lawrence was on it, Fermi was on it, and Oppenheimer was on it. Lawrence suggested dropping the atomic bomb in Tokyo Bay and making a demonstration to show them, hey, look guys, unless you quit, who's gonna do it? But it was Oppenheimer that demanded, no, we're gonna drop this on a city, on a real city. So he was really very at the extreme, really gung-ho to do that. It was only after the bombs were dropped and then attention switched over to thermonuclear research that he started pulling back. In the course of doing that, by the way, which does not come out in the movie, he wanted money put in to make bigger and bigger atomic bombs. So for example, he wanted to build a 50 kiloton atom bomb. So it wasn't as though, even though we said to the Los Alamos crowd, it's immoral to work on nuclear weapons, on the side, he was pushing really hard for America to develop more atomic bombs. But don't go into the thermonuclear part. And it just doesn't make it look suspicious. But what was the motive behind all of this? And I don't know how to get the religion into this. He was kind of an agnostic. He was Jewish, but he didn't really practice Judaism at all. And I'm trying to bring up the morality, what I wanted to bring up in my first, when I mentioned my baccalaureate, that in my own morality, I do not have qualms about working on nuclear weapons because I truly believe in deterrence. And I don't think Jesus would ever condemn me for that, which is why I open up that way. So as I'm talking about the heroic efforts made by physicists to come up and make the United States strong enough to defend itself and deter the Soviet Union is a highly moral act. If you were following this in the 1980s, the American bishops were going to come up with a proclamation condemning deterrence. And when they had their meetings, they turned it around. Father Kwame will probably correct me. And I attended the meetings. Bishop Cummins held colloquia, and I attended. I was a member of those colloquia, in which Father O'Hare, was a priest, came in. Bishop Cummins came in, and he gave us lectures on the definition of just wars and the Catholic theology doing the just wars and that. And in the end, despite all the rhetoric that was going on, the American bishops and of course Bishop Cummins and all of us sitting there agreed that having a strong defense, a deterrent structure, was very moral and very Catholic to do that. I just didn't go into that because that wasn't in the movie either. But thank you, because now you got me to talk about religion.
We have another question?
Yes, sir.
I thought,
Yeah.
can you comment more on the part of the security clearance process? You see the movie that has stressed a lot about it. Like Oppenheimer has such a background with so many things related to communism. But they need it, so they grant it security clearance.
Yes.
And then later on, they withdraw it. And it seems the movie try to say that there's some problem with the process. And even now, today, if you have any question about security clearance, how can one address that?
The answer is that there were guidelines, and Oppenheimer violated the guidelines, but over the exigency of the Manhattan Project going, and there was so much laying on us saying we needed to get the bomb made real quick, that Groves recommended we waive the guidelines and grant Oppenheimer a clearance anyway. The FBI is very vocal in saying Oppenheimer cannot get a clearance. He's just, you can't give this guy clearance. And Groves finally used his pull all the way up to the president that waived that. So even though we did have guidelines, Oppenheimer did not meet the guidelines, but they waived it. It was only when President Eisenhower put out that executive order now that said any kind of behavior that was suspicious, now by presidential order, you will revoke the clearance. And Eisenhower then demanded the Atomic Energy Commission revoke Oppenheimer's clearance. That fell in line, that everything fell back in line. So it wasn't as though the criteria changed, it was they waived him, they gave him a waiver.
The latest news is that the Department of Energy Secretary apologized
to him,
Yeah,
so.
she didn't consult with me before she did that.
Okay, maybe one or two more questions?
Hi, Tom. Lots of talk of lots of very smart people, lots of physicists, but in your opinion, give us the one or two top mathematicians that have been involved in the golden age of nuclear energy.
Mathematicians or physicists?
Mathematicians.
Well, Oppenheimer obviously comes right to the fore. Ulam become very fast. Mathematicians. Ulam and von Neumann come immediately to mind. I have to think about more math. Well, Loomis, there's a man named Alfred Loomis, who was an amateur mathematician. He had a lot of influence in events that occurred. He's not mentioned I have him in my book, but I didn't mention him here. Von Neumann by far. Von Neumann is just up here. And Fermi his mathematical skills were beyond reach. But he was a physicist. He said, I am a physicist, but his mathematical skills were phenomenal.
Okay, we have one last question.
For those of you who would like to find information about what Tom was talking about the discussions that went on, Bishop John Cummins wrote a memoir. He had his memoir entitled Vatican II, Berkeley and Beyond. And in that book, he documents all the meetings that he helped organize between the professors of Berkeley, the theology professors, professors of the Graduate Theological Union, and Berkeley
And physicists from the lab.
Physicists from the lab. And they had meetings all over, bringing a lot of church prelates to come and speak. Cardinals and bishops were coming, and you had those meetings yearly. And one of those meetings, I think the last one, took place in St. Mary's College in Moraga. And in the book, in that chapter that talks about all those meetings, I read the book and recognized many of the names from our parishioners here, from St. Charles, like Seguda,
Bill Seguda was an organizer.
Very, very popular in that those meetings. So yeah, that's documented. The book is maybe we sent a book. And when you read this book, it will be good to read the memoir of Bishop Cummins.
So he doesn't mention me. I'm so disappointed.
We'll write another book, Tom.
Thank you, Tom, for sharing your knowledge with us. I didn't realize we lived in such a great community here. But thank you for coming, and Tom's lovely wife Rose made cookies for us, and there's some refreshments there. And if you have any other questions, you can pin Tom down before he leaves. Thank you again for coming.